Representative Sean Patrick Maloney to the stage. So Sean, before you begin, I would like you to take note of the woman in the front row who will be keeping time for us. And we ask that your opening statement be no more than 5 minutes, and for individual questions, you have 90 minutes to respond. So, yours.
No problem. Well, thank you so much to the League of Conservation Voters. This is too much, let me know. And to all the organizations participating. Thank you to all of you for being here in historic Federal Hall. You know, it was 2 years ago that I came before you, and I asked you to give me your voice and your vote, and to send me down to Washington. And I'm very proud of the record I've built over that 2 years in Washington, and we are doing so much good work. And we've started so many important initiatives that will help our Hudson Valley communities and our Hudson Valley environment. You know, I should tell you that when I got to Congress, it was a mess. Important legislation, like the Violence Against Women Act, had been left to wither on the vine. Things like the Farm Bill, which is critical for our communities, and the conservation provisions in it had become caught up in this gridlock. And other important measures. Thank you. I'm not sure I need the mic. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just recording.
Really? All right. We're going to record it. Had been caught up in this gridlock in Washington, and worse, there were so many efforts afoot in the Tea Party Congress to roll back a generation or more of important environmental protections. And so we went to work. And I want to tell you, if you think I'm making it up, look no further than something called the RAINS Act, which my opponent has trumpeted at every joint appearance we've had this season. This organization, the League of Conservation Voters, called the RAINS Act a radical, redundant, unnecessary attempt to roll back all kinds of environmental and consumer safety protections. It would make absolutely impossible any kind of sensible regulation, and would subject important regulations, if you can believe it, to a vote of the Congress. So if you want to stop something, leave it up to the United States Congress to decide whether we should have important safety and environmental regulations. And worse, on issues like greenhouse gas emissions and clean air and clean water, there was an effort to destroy the authority of the EPA to do important things. Look, on the most important issues facing our environment in the Hudson Valley, fracking, Indian Point, climate change, there's a big difference in this race. And I invite you to examine the record. On fracking, my opponent supports it. I don't. She supports it on federal lands, like the West Point Military Reservation, like the Appalachian Trail, like the Delaware River National Park, like the Wallkill National Bird Sanctuary. I would never allow that. On Indian Point, she has attacked me from one end of this district to the other for saying we should have a sensible plan to close Indian Point, to move away from it. My kids go to sleep 10 miles from it. I'm terrified of an accident at that nuclear power station. We know we would never locate a nuclear power station where that plant is today, and we can, in a responsible way, move away from generating nuclear power at that site and do it in a way that saves jobs and helps our economy. On the issue of global warming, the centerpiece of our national strategy for reducing carbon emissions is the national plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired plants by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. The cornerstone of the plan is to use the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. My opponent voted to deny the EPA authority to do that. My opponent would destroy the key national strategy which we are now using to fight climate change. So whether it's fracking or climate change or Indian Point, there is a very big difference between us. And so it's little wonder that this organization gave my opponent a score of 44% when she was in Congress on important votes, as scored by the LCV. Now, I have two little girls. They come home with 44% on a test. We're not happy about that. That's not a cause for celebration. She may come in here and say, I've got one of the best records in the Republican Tea Party Congress on the environment. She's right. And 44% of the votes that matter to this organization and all of us. It's because this is the most radical, most anti-environmental Congress we have ever seen in our lifetimes, and we have to stop the terrible things they want to do, like the Rains Act, like allowing fracking without regulations, like destroying our strategy on climate change, and like continuing with no plan to move away from it, Indian point. So I look forward to discussing those issues and more with you. Thank you for the honor of serving you in Congress. It's been a thrill of my life to be your voice and your vote. I'm asking you to renew this contract for 2 years. I hope we get a chance to talk about all the other things we're working on. I've passed 13 bipartisan bills through the House of Representatives in 2 years. I bet you didn't know Congress passed 13 bills in around 2 years. I've authored over 20 of those pieces of legislation. 3 of those bills, of the 13 that passed the House, have been signed into law by the President. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Let's start with Tom Robideau.
Sure. Let's catch your breath.
Please, Tom, can you give it a mic?
And okay, I'll try this one. Yeah, it's fine. Just in case. All right, Congressman, thank you very much for the introduction. I want to dive right into something that's I think is pretty important. I work at the Pace Energy and Climate Center, so energy is on my mind. Decades of experience and confirm that energy efficiency, the wise use of the energy that we have, is the most cost-effective and least polluting energy resource we have available. That's true through programs that have been run by the federal government, such as labeling and standards programs, as well as programs run at the state level and in local communities. However, federal support for energy efficiency has been a little bit erratic. I'm wondering where you stand and what you think you can do so that we can take advantage of this very cost-effective, very environmentally friendly resource today and in the future.
Thanks. Well, I forgot the most important thing in my opening, which is my husband is here, Randy Clarkey. Where are you? Raise your hand. Say hello. I raised that because I love you, but because he also ran a company that built green-friendly modular homes. This is something that he spent a lot of time on that I'm very interested in. Because you're right, because conservation is the best generation. Conservation is the best way to create more energy without more carbon, without more pollution. That's why I'm carrying in the House the Pace Energy Bill. For people who don't know, the property tax clean energy legislation would allow homeowners to make sensible improvements to their homes and finance it out of their property taxes, and the improvement would travel with the deed. Now, there's some red tape down in Washington. We're going to blow through that. That's a great program. It'll help local contractors. It'll speed energy efficiency. It'll save energy. It'll create jobs. I'm also the sponsor, I wrote a bill called the SMART Act, which would allow massive investments in our schools using green technology so that we can modernize our schools with energy efficient improvements, particularly those damaged by superstorms, and at once invest in our school infrastructure, which is badly in need of repair, but do so in an environmentally sensible way. So we're saving energy, so we're lowering the cost. And the most important thing is to have the renewable tax credits continue in effect, so that we continue to make competitive true renewables, so that folks can make those improvements at a reasonable cost, and we can move towards greater reliance on true renewable sources.
A question from our audience. What would you consider your greatest environmental accomplishment in Congress?
Well, I think the most important work that I've done in Congress that has had a real impact is on these energy shipments coming through the Hudson Valley. We now have approximately 5 billion gallons a year with a peak moving through the Hudson Valley. I live on the river. It's hard to look across the river these days without seeing an oil train going down the Hudson River, or seeing a barge that's moving this crude down the Hudson River. It was never the plan to use crude by rail or crude by barge. There were supposed to be pipelines, there were supposed to be other ways to transmit this profitable crude. And we are not doing it right. The cars are not safe, there aren't enough controls on it. And we have legislation called the Passenger Rail Safety Act that just got passed out of committee, that I'm very proud of in a bipartisan way, that would open up federal sources of funding to use what's called positive train control, Wi-Fi and GPS technology to stop these derailments. If we have a derailment of one of those crude trains, it's going to be horrific, I guarantee it. Or God forbid, a terrorist attack. And we have been all over the Department of Transportation to get better regs on this, to get these cars off the rail, to get better speed limits, to have local notification required, to train up our first responders, and a bunch of other things. We have got to get control over the oil shipments coming down the Hudson River And I've been a leader on that in Congress, and I'm very proud of that.
Andy?
Thank you. Good evening, Congressman. I think you're well aware of the many benefits of open space and land conservation. My question pertains to the Forest Legacy Management Flexibility Act of 2014, H.R. 4551, which allows qualified not-for-profit land trusts to hold the interests in land conservation easements that are financed in part by Forest Legacy funds. And this would take place if the state voluntarily chooses to elect this as an option for a particular easement. I'm wondering, do you support this measure? And related to that, what plans do you have to support Forest Legacy funds in the future?
Well, absolutely, I support it. And the other accomplishment I was going to cite in Congress is my work in the Farm Bill to promote conservation policies. And we have done a ton of work with the land trusts all over the Hudson Valley. Groups like Scenic Hudson, groups like Hudson Highlands Land Trust, Orange County Land Trust, and others, to write into the Farm Bill the best conservation provisions I think we've ever had. We put $1 billion in the Farm Bill to assist conservation. You know the standing. You've been in my office talking about it many times. And I wrote the amendment to the legislation that would improve the flexibility of the Secretary of Agriculture to use what's called the non-cash match, to waive the requirement that there be more cash put in by the private folks. It's tough. We've got a land alliance that doesn't have a lot of resources to get the cash necessary to trigger the federal funds. We made that more flexible and reduced that amount. I wrote that legislation. And we got the Farm Bill done. And the whole movement around conservation is so exciting to me because it is bipartisan, it is grassroots, it has the support of Democrats, Republicans, community activists, farmers, wealthy landowners, and everybody in between. And it is a triple win. It helps our local agricultural economy, it helps our economy in general, it helps our farmers themselves, it helps our environment. And I think the forest program is a great example of where we can do more of that. And it is absolutely critical that we do it in time to do us some good. That's why we had to get the Farm Bill passed when we did, because the last Congress had done nothing on this. I'm sorry to say my predecessor didn't even get on the committee and did no work on this. And that delay is killing us in a state where we're losing thousands of acres of farmland to development every year. We've got to get stuff done.
A question from our audience. What is your position on the Algonquin pipeline?
I have no concerns about the Algonquin pipeline. For those of you who don't know, this is an existing pipeline. It travels mostly south of the district I represent, but it does come pretty close to some communities and can have some impact on the community. I wrote legislation as part of the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill, together with Republican Congressman Chris Eason, to require FERC to take more local input on projects like this and every other. Because FERC has done a terrible job, if you ask me, on working with local communities to find out what they care about and what their concerns are. And 26,000 of our neighbors signed a petition saying we're worried about this thing. We need to pay attention to it. So I want to slow it down until we have our questions answered, until we know what the real plan is and what the impact is going to be on those communities.
Joe?
Thank you, Congressman. This question does not pertain specifically to the environment, but certainly in terms of legislating environmental issues. Do you think that there's any way to end the congressional gridlock and dysfunction in Washington we've seen? And what would you do individually to set a new tone beginning next year if you're reelected that I think most people would agree really needs to happen?
Thank you for this question. This is a very important question. Please look at the record. That's what I ask you to do. You're looking at someone who is in the top 3% of all members of Congress for bipartisanship. That's not me talking. That's Congressional Quarterly and the National Journal that ranks us by our votes. So 97% of the Congress is more partisan than I am. Now, sometimes I get in trouble for working across the aisle because there are folks in my own party that don't want me to do that. But I just mentioned to you, I passed 13 bipartisan bills in about a year and a half in the United States Congress. My predecessor passed one, and it didn't become law, and it was the name of a post office. I've passed legislation that reduces visibility, and I'm sorry to sound flip about it, but those are just the facts. My bills are bipartisan. My work is bipartisan. If you look right now, I've got the Republican head of the New York State Senate Veterans Committee supporting my campaign. Why? some real good work on veterans, because I passed a bipartisan bill called the Red Tape Reduction Act, which lowers disability claim wait times for our vets, and we were a year ahead of the VA scandal, to allow people to go outside that system to get help. If you look at why the Republican state senator from Orange County is out there praising young veterans, it's because he and I are working together on the Purple Heart Hall of Honor. So talk is cheap on bipartisanship. I am in the top 3% of Congress for bipartisan votes, and I have real results. And it's making a difference. If you look at our work in Hopewell Junction, where we've got the funds to clean up that Superfund site after decades of inaction, it's because I'm working with the Republican town supervisor named John Hickman to get the funds in place. And the EPA is going to put that project before the National Priorities Board in a couple of months, and a solution the residents want for clean water. We're going to get it done. So talk is cheap. These are the results. And I want to keep working on this stuff for you. That's why I want to renewal this 2-year contract, and I'm asking for your support.
A question from the audience. What is your position on GMOs?
Yeah, GMOs, we've got to follow science, is my position on GMOs. And we shouldn't be afraid of science on either side. And I think it's just that simple. I am always in favor of telling the consumer more. We shouldn't be afraid of giving information to the consumer. But we also have to make sure it's based in science. And I think that's just common sense.
Paul?
Good evening, Congressman Maloney, and good evening to my friends from Bedford. I have a question that is about our infrastructure here in New York State. New York State Controller Thomas DiNapoli issued a report in September stating that we are spending about $200 million a year on our water infrastructure, which sounds good until you realize that the need is 5 times as much, $1 billion. Just to avoid falling further behind with wastewater infrastructure needs here in New York. Please speak generally about the importance of infrastructure investment and specifically about what you will do if you return to Congress to help close that gap.
Well, it's a great question. I can tell you specifically what I'm doing right now. I mean, the general answer to the question is we need massive investments in American infrastructure. You all know this. You've ridden a car on a road around here lately, you know this. You ever gone on a bridge lately, you know this. We are not investing in our own infrastructure. It's us, we need to do it. I have a bill that would tie repatriation of corporate profits overseas to hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure investments right here in the United States, and we wouldn't have to do it all with public dollars. I have real ideas on this, and I created a public-private partnership commission when I was in the governor's office here in New York, because I believe we need to leverage public and private dollars together. But on water infrastructure, and it's a great answer to the previous question, on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on which I serve, and on the Water Resources Subcommittee on which I serve, we passed the Water Resources Development Act this year, something called WRDA. Now, WRDA sounds like a Washington thing, but it's actually a local need. Let me tell you what it is. There is, for the first time in 20 years, a reauthorization of the State Revolving Clean Water Fund. That's very important. There's going to be the money for those revolving funds that communities use to do water infrastructure improvements. There's also something called the WIPIA program that allows financing under the same terms that we're doing the Tappan Zee Bridge for water projects. So together with leveraging private capital, opening up new sources of federal funding, and supporting proven methods like the state revolving funds, we can do the infrastructure investments we need. But I won't stop at water. I want a whole new generation of investments in American infrastructure. It's going to create wealth and jobs for a generation and help grow our middle class.
A question from our audience. In your filing in opposition to FERC's new Hudson Valley Capacity Zone, you referenced transmission as a key piece in our solution to the problem of inadequate local capacity. Does that mean you support the addition of high-capacity transmission lines into and through our communities?
It means that I think that through conservation and through certain transmission alternatives, we can address whatever capacity needs may or may not arise. And together with supporting renewable energy projects, things like CASE, things like the renewable project in Orange County, biomass project that I'm supporting, I hope to reduce the need for transmission. But there are good transmission alternatives to raising everybody's energy prices locally, and it doesn't need things. You gotta do it smart on existing rights of way, underground, so that you don't create visual pollution and other problems like that. But I do think that it is terrible to just arbitrarily raise everybody's energy prices by 6 to 10%. And working in a bipartisan bipartisan fashion with Congressman Chris Dixon, we passed a bill through the House of Representatives that'll stop this energy price hike in its tracks. And we're working very hard on that right now. FERC's agreed to reopen it in a couple of weeks in response to what we've done. And this is a big issue between me and my opponent. Bear in mind that everywhere we go, she said she would have supported the RAINS Act as a way to stop this thing. Now, you talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, folks. The RAINS Act is the bill I mentioned at the top of this forum that this organization is called a radical assault on environmental and consumer safety protections. It would destroy all kinds of health and safety regulation, and I hope you'll ask Congresswoman Hayward to explain their support of it. It is a Tea Party fantasy. It's nuts, and we shouldn't do it. There are targeted, smart ways to do this, and conservation and better local generation through renewables and smart transmission is a much better alternative. It's certainly better than throwing out a generation of health and safety regulation with something called the RAINS Act.
Carl?
Congressman, the United States has invented or substantially improved some of the most important energy inventions in the last 50 years. Solar technology, wind technology, fuel cell technology. The United States relies on tax credits as a primary means of encouraging the development of new industries, and we always have, different from other countries. The last time we had a meaningful extension of tax credits for renewable energy, we were in the throes of a terrible near recession. And now those credits are about to expire, and the industries are grinding to a halt again. Hopefully we don't have another recession to get Congress to do serious long-term funding of this kind of tax credit for developing these resources. How do we get past this year on again, off again, federal support for these necessary technologies?
Well, the way you get past it is you stop sending people to Washington who can't work with anybody, and you stop sending people to Washington who describe themselves as radicals, and you think that there's some simple, easy, and terribly wrong solution out there that we can have. If you pass the Ryan budget, the Hayworth plan, remember the Ryan budget? If you pass the Hayworth budget plan, which she still supports and voted for twice, you are going to destroy all sorts of important tax credits and deductions as part of this effort to balance the budget, because you're giving huge tax cuts to multimillionaires and doing all sorts of other dumb stuff, and we're not investing where we should. Congresswoman Hayward repeatedly in this campaign has said we can't do anything at the federal level that makes sense. Every time we try to, quote, pick winners and losers, we're making a terrible mistake. She criticizes me for my support of a biomass project in Orange County that I have stood up the President of the United States on to get through the Energy Loan Guarantee Program. It's the #1 rated project in that program. We ought to do it. I absolutely support renewing the critical renewable investment tax credits. And the key to getting them renewed permanently is having an intelligent budget that comes into balance the right way. We did during the Clinton administration. We paid down the debt. We would have been on our way to a debt-free country right now if we had left those policies in place. And that means you don't start by doing things that are going to give us a way through carbon-based sources into true renewables. Together with her support of fracking and her opposition to our carbon reduction strategy, Congresswoman Hayward's policy would be devastating to the renewables industry. And we couldn't be more different on this issue. It's a very big difference between them.
Another question from our audience. The necessity for greening the economy has never been a central part of your campaign. Can you give a sense of where you stand on this?
The necessity for what is? I'm sorry, can you?
The necessity for greening the economy
Greening the
has never been a central part of your campaign.
Well, I have a bill called the Smart Act that I spoke about that would make school modernization and construction dependent on green modernization. So I'm pretty proud of that. I think it's a great idea, and particularly in schools that have been damaged by Superstorm Sandy or Irene or Lee, where we have funds in the pipeline right now. It seems to me it makes a lot of sense to do that in an energy smart way. The PACE program, that would open up a generation of homeowners making improvements one at a time, together with the renewable energy credits that reduce the cost of these things. So I absolutely support those. And I absolutely believe that we can have a strong economy where we return manufacturing to the United States, where we create good middle-class jobs again in this country, and we still take care of our environment. And we have a real plan to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in a dramatic way. The cornerstone of that strategy, I want to say it again, is the EPA's ability to regulate, under the Clean Air Act, greenhouse gas emissions. My opponent would destroy that ability and take it away from the EPA. I support it.
Andy?
Congressman, regional trail networks are essential infrastructure that is important for tourism, regional economic development, public health, and recreation. What will you do to facilitate their planning, design, and construction, both through legislation and at the district level?
Well, we're working right now on a number of them, and we brought a number of federal grants back to help communities with greater pedestrian trails, greater rail and trail programs. One of the impacts of becoming a major transmission throughway for oil shipments is that the railroads are much more reluctant to open up unused right-of-ways for trail. That's why we need to do this fast and smart, and we need to get on top of these oil shipments. But if you look at where I live in Cold Spring, we're right now supporting a plan to have a trail from Cold Spring up to Beacon called the Fjord Trail, which will be absolutely spectacular. Everybody all come over and spend all your money on local restaurants and stores. It's a beautiful part of the world, but right now, to get to Breakneck Bridge, to get to the hiking, you literally walk along Route 9. There's nowhere to park. There's nowhere to get there from the train. And so that's just smart development. That's just smart policy to open up those areas to greater tourism, help our economy, and to further the local consensus around preserving our green space, our open spaces, things like the conservation program. So I support those efforts. I think they're very smart uses of our energy, of our dollars. And let me just say, because sometimes people think, well, you're supporting this, you're supporting that. I believe in a balanced budget. I believe Democrats have to be dead serious about being fiscally responsible. I'd like to remind people that in the Clinton administration, we balanced the budget and we're paying down the debt. We can make better choices as a country where we're investing in ourselves, we're investing in our communities, we're investing in our environment, and we can balance our budget. We have done it before. But we have to stop smoking this dope of giving huge tax cuts to multimillionaires and giving all kinds of giveaways to the fossil fuel industry and the oil industry. And we've got to make better choices, and those are some great choices.
A question for our audience. Recently, over 26,000 local residents signed a petition opposing Specter's pipeline as being too dangerous for Westchester, Putnam, and Rockland counties. All three counties, including Democrats and Republicans, passed resolutions calling for independent safety and health impact assessments and baseline testing of air and water prior to considering approval. Your voice has been silent on the issue. Will you respond?
Yeah, it's not true. In fact, my voice was just pretty loud about 5 minutes ago because we had a question on the Westchester pipeline, the same one. And what I said was that, I don't know who asked the question, I'm sorry, that we should do a better job of communicating this. I wrote legislation that was passed as part of the appropriations bill for all the energy and water stuff. Because I'm on the committee and I work across the aisle to get it done, to make for taking the kind of local input that's lacking on this project. I think it's very important. I support it. And I don't know how to make my voice more heard than pass a bill in the United States House of Representatives. See, a lot of guys go up and talk about it, and a lot of people give you a lot of gobbledygook. Ask them what they've done. You know, it's my job to represent you in the Congress. It's not my job to forget about you when I'm down there. It's my job to take local concerns and to bring them there and to get a result for you. That's the tangent point between talking about it and doing something that matters. And on this, we have put legislative language in FERC's appropriations bill saying they must do this. That's a real thing. I'm proud of it.
Joe?
Congressman, do you think the long-term government response to Hurricanes Sandy and Irene in terms of rebuilding and sustainability has been sufficient or more proactive measures should be taken?
Well, it was a mess when I got there. We waited 75 days to get passed. We got it passed right away, and we made it retroactive to Lee and Irene, which, particularly in Orange County, was more serious than Superstorm Sandy. So the response was too slow to get off the ground, number one. Number two, we have to guard against efforts to pull some of the funding back and use it for other things, and we've been very active on that. But most importantly, we are working with local communities. We have a list in my office of 123 specific requests from 48 communities for $330 million of disaster-related projects. Not that we came up with it, but that the town supervisors came up with, that the county executives came up with, that people working at the local level said this is important. Not just because we had damage, but because it's the critical mitigation work that we need to do now before the next storm. Because we know $1 of mitigation is worth $4 of disaster relief. So I want to do more of that. I've met repeatedly with the governor's staff on this, And I'm proud to tell you that we have returned to date $169 million of disaster relief to communities all over the Hudson Valley, and much of it focused on mitigation projects for the future. And we'll keep at it because it was the unfinished business when I got to Washington, and I take it very seriously. But I am very focused on policies that start to understand that we are changing our climate, that we are responsible for warming our climate, and there are all kinds of implications for that. My opponent gave an interview to the Bedford Patch during the last cycle, in which she said she wasn't sure about the science of global warming. So in addition to being against the cornerstone of our strategy, which is empowering EPA under the Clean Air Act to regulate this stuff, she said she wasn't sure about the science. I mean, my God, are we going to send a climate science denier to Congress from the Hudson Valley? I think we can do that.
Paul?
6 years ago, presidential candidate Obama and presidential candidate McCain both supported bipartisan action on climate change. Today, only the barest shred of bipartisanship remains on the issue. What happened, and what can you do to help restore bipartisan agreement on the issue?
Well, I think that there is a way through where it does help if we suspend the debate about what's happening and just look at the effect of these different weather patterns. There is more bipartisanship agreement that has been raining a lot. There is by more, even these Republican guys will admit that Superstorm Sandy was a pretty bad storm, even though they waited months and months to do disaster relief. So I do find that they have more listening on this if you let them get around the question they're so terrified of, which is to say, for some reason, the obvious thing, which is that our activities are contributing to climate change. That if you look at the science on this, if you can't hate what you can deny it, but if you look at the science on this, there is an overwhelming consensus that we have higher levels of carbon in our atmosphere than we've ever had for thousands of years, and we are the primary cause of it. Therefore, sensible people can work to address this, and I don't think it should be a partisan issue. I can't own all the dysfunction in Washington, but I am responsible for my own record. And if you look at my record working across the aisle, being in the top 3% of all people voting in a bipartisan way in Congress, of passing 13 bipartisan bills, what I have done consistently is find ways to work with people, find areas of common agreement. And while this issue in the Congress is one we play more defense on, because one thing after the other comes out of that Tea Party leadership that says we're going to blow up the EPA, or we're going to take away their ability to regulate anything, or we're going to pass the Brains Act that would, require us to vote on every sensible thing they do in the administration. We play a lot of defense, but I do believe there is a way forward on this, and I believe I built a record of bipartisanship that shows that I'm ready to work with anybody on any viable solution on this. But we can't wait. The worst thing we can do is wait. The worst thing we can do is move sideways, which is why I would always rather compromise and move forward than do nothing.
A question from our audience. The armed forces are arguably the largest polluting entity in the world and largely get passed. Would you be willing to subject them to the standards we demand of civilians?
There's all kinds of ways we can run the Pentagon better. I have not looked closely at the environmental issues of the way we run the Defense Department, though it would not surprise me that we could do a lot of things smart. I know there are some efforts underway on this. What I have been involved in is on the effort to do strategic sourcing from the Pentagon, saving about $50 billion a year. We had the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs come and talk to us and said, we know how to fight wars. What we don't know how to do is run the business side of the Pentagon. And the truth is, he said, in particular, he's a very conservative Republican. He said, Bush folks came in, we were so excited, we thought Donald Rumsfeld was going to teach us how to run this place like a business, and all he wanted to do was tell us how to fight wars. We know how to fight wars. What we want is help on rationalizing our procurement process, on our strategic sourcing, on all the things that corporate America does, well, that is more efficient and gets better results and saves you all money for the same thing. That's got to be true in the area of doing things in ways that every corporation now does to be efficient, to be more environmentally intelligent, and to save money in the process. I just haven't spent a lot of time looking at it, but I can tell you there's a real desire for it within the Pentagon itself, and we should exploit that because you really want the generals on your side on this, so it doesn't become some political football about how we're trying to undermine the military during the war. The truth is they want it because they know they can do better on that side of the equation.
Carl?
Congressman, I'm going to pick up on that a little bit. For years, the Department of Defense has said that global climate change constitutes a global and national security threat. Yesterday, for the first time ever, Chuck Hagel came out with a report saying that it is not just a future security threat, it is a present security threat. With increasing environmental disasters around the world associated with our use of energy and causing climate change, and the burdens that'll place on our ability to respond, to help, and then even in some cases to intervene militarily where those disasters lead to conflict and political destabilization. What's the outlook for accomplishing our agenda? Is there a win-win with all those global challenges and what we have to do at home?
Well, of course there is, and it starts with good policy, right? And I think one of the things that is the biggest difference between us in this race is my opponent has a sincere belief. I don't mean to caricature. She has a sincere belief that if you leave all this stuff up to the private market, everything will be good. And I just think most of our experience as a country is that, of course, the private sector is that energy-creating machine, and we've got to keep that on to improve all of our lives and create a prosperous economy. But my goodness, they're like pistons in an engine. You know, they need to be housed in an engine block that contains that energy, that keeps it running efficiently, that is maintained and upgraded, that has things, inputs into it, like lubricants that keep it moving and not seized up. And that's what smart policy is. Look, capturing the external costs of certain activities is a market mechanism. That's not some left-wing environmental policy. That's a market mechanism for saying we should understand the cost of the products we produce, including their environmental costs. But on the issue you raised, of course, look at what's going on, the horrific situation in West Africa right now. Look, we know that when we engage in wholesale deforestation, when we engage in all sorts of environmentally destructive practices, that we create much greater stress on our resources, like water, like the land. We get greater incidence of infectious disease. And we have got to stop engaging in these activities, working with our international partners, before we become the country that has to try to clean it all up. I couldn't agree more. I do think the smartest thing we can do right now is continue the very healthy move away from carbon emissions from coal-fired plants. And the efforts to do that around our national strategy are so important. And the Congresswoman's opposition to that, I think, is just terrible. And that single thing is the most important thing we can do to stop the kind of global warming and climate change that results in the kind of effects that our military is going to have to deal with. I mean, there is a root cause of this problem, but we have to get serious about it now, and we can do it. There are market mechanisms and there are intelligent policies that we can adopt now that will move us through away from coal, through natural gas, and through renewables in time to do us some good. And we can lead the world on it, and we can get the jobs ready.
Andy?
Thank you. The U.S. EPA has proposed a new rule defining waters of the United States to clarify them and allow for their protection under the Clean Water Act. Could you please state your position on this proposal?
Right, well, there was a bill in the House to get in the way of that, and I voted against it. My only concern on this is that we do it in a way that makes sense for our farmers, and I think we can easily do both. There's a lot of heat energy around this among the Tea Party guys in the Congress, but their solution is terrible, and I was proud to oppose it.
5 minutes.
Thank you to our panel, thank you Annette, thank you to all the folks here in the audience, because I know we are all here together because we care about our environment, not only here in Bedford, but throughout our Hudson Valley, throughout New York State, our country, and the world. And it is a privilege to be with neighbors tonight. We've been in Bedford. This month we've been in our house for 25 years. Raised my boys here. They went to Fox Lane, very proud alumni. I had the privilege of serving you, as you know, in 2011 and 2012 in the House of Representatives. I am one of the members of that House majority who was most sensitive to issues involving our environment, most protective of our environment as a doctor, and I think most folks here know I'm privileged to have served patients here in Mount Kisco and patients around, obviously, our area for some 16 years. As a doctor, I care very much about your health, about the health of our kids, our neighbors, and indeed of our planet. And my record in the House is actually one of the very best in the House majority. In fact, Marcia Eastern did praise my record. I was honored to have her praise. I was recognized by the Sierra Club and by other environmentally protected groups for my work, often in opposition, as you know, to my fellow members in the House majority, in order to represent the environment. And my principles have always been, as you know, and as I've discussed with LCD, which I'm proud to support, my principles have always been that we need balance and sustainability. We need environmental sustainability. We also need to have economic sustainability and fiscal sustainability and all the measures that we undertake together. So I work very hard and with integrity and honesty in your behalf to make sure that all of those principles are honored so that we can have a way forward together that we will be able not only to put into place now, but be able to sustain, be able to propagate in the future. So I want to thank you for the interest that we all share. I'm going to mention one other little bio point. I was privileged to serve on the board of Good Serve America, which is a Republican leading group of environmentally active people who want to honor the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt, who, as you know, established our national parks and was an unabashed, enthusiastic, and forceful voice for our environment and for land conservation. Topics that dear to me as well. And I have the privilege of carrying their enforcement in this election. So with that, I'm going to look forward to answering your questions and hearing your thoughts and having a conversation with you tonight. So thank you. Thank you all.
So I'll start off with a question from our audience. You spent 2 years in Congress. What would you consider your greatest environmental accomplishment in those 2 years?
Well, I introduced a bill while I was in the House of Representatives. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One we did achieve, and Andy, before I forget, this is of a more local nature, perhaps worth mentioning first. I worked with Steen and Hudson, I worked with Riverkeeper, I think Paul, as I recall, about the PCB cleanup of the Hudson River. And Andy came to me and said, we need more time to evaluate the results of an interim phase. The EPA is not granting us enough time to do that. Would you appeal in our behalf so we can make sure the cleanup's doing what it's supposed to do before they proceed further? And I did appeal to the EPA, and we were successful in that, and they did have the time that they needed to evaluate the results, because this PCB cleanup, of course, is a very important multi-year project that has to be done right. I obviously supported the Highlands Conservation Act so that we could fund land conservation throughout the Hudson Valley, and also not only provide the tax incentives, but provide for federal funding allowances. And I introduced, I was the originator of the PACE Protection Act. The PACE program, our good friend Don Scott and David Gabrielson, great bipartisan coalition here with Jeff Tannenbaum, who actually had the idea from Katona. The PACE program is a great way to make energy-saving, water-saving improvements on homes and properties and finance them affordably. Lee Roberts knows all about it. Finance them affordably through property tax assessment. And I introduced that act to let homeowners across the country participate in that, which currently they cannot.
Thank you. Let's start with a question from our panel. Paul?
Dr. Hale, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Some have. During the New York LCD candidate forum in Congressional District 19, the incumbent Republican Congressman Chris Gibson candidly acknowledged our changing weather patterns and candidly acknowledged acknowledge that carbon motives, man-made implications of carbon motives is part of that problem. Would you like to join in this evening and acknowledge man-made climate change?
I would agree. I am very concerned about man's contribution to climate change. My background, as you know, is in the sciences. So I certainly accept the science on this, and I think we need to continue to monitor and assess very carefully every piece of evidence that we have. Obviously, this is a massive project to understand our climate as our default position, no matter what may be the assessment. But again, I default to, yes, there is a man-made contribution to climate change, and we have to do all we can to minimize it, to minimize our impact, minimize our carbon footprints, which is why I was the originator of the Pace Protection Act for precisely that reason. It's also why I voted against the House majority, against something called the Train Act, which would reduce the ability of the EPA to regulate dangerous gases, which is why I voted repeatedly on amendments that impeded the progress of the coal industry, coal mining, coal burning plants, which are major pollutants. So I believe very strongly that we need to minimize our carbon footprints and that we need to take and incentivize measures that will do that.
So a question from the audience on that same note. Now that climate change is recognized as a threat to national security, would you support federal legislation to aid towns and municipalities in Westchester and the Hudson Valley to prepare for floods, disasters, and the effects of superstorms?
Yes, absolutely. We saw the effects of both hurricane. Sorry to do that, but somebody's talking to us. Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee, and of course then Superstorm Sandy. These were devastating storms that were unprecedented, and of course they were barely a year apart. We have to be very concerned about those things. We have to help our citizens prepare for that. We have to strengthen our infrastructure. And absolutely, we have to, as a nation, prioritize that kind of shoring up of our communities. And again, it does go back to the whole issue of our carbon footprints. You know, this is one systematic approach. I think of my Jewish family, Tikkun Olam, and we do have to protect our world. So yes, I believe very much that we have to incentivize and support this. Sure.
And then the Algonquin pipeline expansion has garnered quite a bit of discussion. Are you in favor or opposed?
I am in favor of pipeline transmission of oil and gas. I think it is far safer than using railcars, which are dangerous for a number of reasons, as we all know, particularly in the communities here in the Hudson Valley. But we have to have accountability to our communities as to where we locate these pipelines and where we locate the compressor stations. And as a matter of fact, in 2012, when folks in Minisink, which is a town in Orange County, objected to the construction of a natural gas compressor station in the middle of a neighborhood in Minisink, I appealed to FERC in their behalf, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I appealed to FERC. I stood with them in protest. Unfortunately, we were not successful, and I don't want to, I think it is ungracious to dwell on one's opponent negatively. However, I will tell you that then candidate Maloney did not stand with the folks in Minisink. He thought the compressor station should be there. I disagree strongly. We have to be accountable for our communities with regard to these things. We have to have that balance of community concerns, global concerns, national concerns when it comes to our energy portfolio. And I thought it was wrong to do that. They could have located the compressor station a few miles away. They didn't. And I protested that. And I will continue to do the same thing for our communities anytime those sorts of issues arise.
A question from our audience. The armed forces are arguably the largest polluting entity in the world and largely get a pass. Would you be willing to subject them to the standards we demand of civilians?
Every endeavor of the federal government should be subjected to high standards of environmental performance. Again, we have to balance in terms of our concerns in advancing key objectives that may be time sensitive. There may be initiatives that have to be prioritized in a slightly different way, but the goal should definitely be to have an environmental footprint by our military operations that respects our concerns with climate. I agree.
Andy?
Thank you. As you know, conserving land has many benefits. The Forest Legacy Management Flexibility Act, House Bill 4551, allows qualified nonprofit land trusts to hold the interest in land conservation easements financed in part by forest legacy funds. And this would occur if a state voluntarily chooses to elect this option for a particular conservation project. Would you support this measure? And what would you do for funding for the Forest Legacy Program and other federal conservation programs?
I think that in a great nation, the funding for conservation programs is actually a fairly nominal issue in terms of the federal budget. So, as you know, I fought for the Hudson Valley to be provided with conservation funds that it otherwise might not have been eligible for. And I think it's important to have that kind of advocacy in behalf of our local forests as well as to have that opportunity across the country. I know this isn't specifically our topic here, but I will tell you that as an advocate for that balance and that sustainability, there are certainly measures that we can take, for which I'm an advocate, that would allow us to have much more robustness as an economy and make the issue of funding these sorts of great initiatives that really are nominal costs much less painful than they are now. That's one of my fundamental principles. Let's put people back to work in the United States, and then we'll be able to do all the things we want to do as a great nation.
So, a question from the audience. If you agree that climate change is real and accelerating, how will you convince your House colleagues to act now to avoid the worst consequences of climate change?
I've been asked that question before, and it's a great question. One of the ways we do that is by having voices within the House majority party and within the House majority delegation who can present these arguments. Because it is a matter of having advocates and colleagues among ourselves who can make the case. And people like me can make the case. I have made the case. And I have led on environmental concerns in the House Republican Conference. I seek to join them again so that I can once again be that voice. It's obviously much more readily accomplished when I'm in those private sessions with the House majority than it is from outside the majority. Carl.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I've got a question about energy efficiency. It's the most affordable energy resource we have. Saves many times its cost for all kinds of customers. It has no pollution. It's cheaper than power plants, cheaper than transmission. It's a great resource.
Energy efficiency.
Energy efficiency. The federal government has been wildly successful in its energy efficiency programs with codes and standards, with development support, with information and labeling programs. What would you do in Congress to make sure that more Americans got the opportunities and the benefits of more efficient use of energy?
Well, I think, if you look at a program like the one that, the legislation that I originated, the PACE Protection Program, I think if you look at the ways in which in that program, we try to help incentivize through local property tax assessment zones, we incentivize environmentally sound, sensible, protective measures that people can make on their homes or properties. So I think if you provide those sorts of incentives in wise ways that are accessible to as many Americans as possible. PACE would be, if we could have a PACE program accessible to every mortgage holder in the country, right now it's limited to about 10% of them, it'd be a wonderful help. And I think, you know, consumer demand is there if we can have a prosperous economy and that balance. If we have a prosperous economy, people are much more inclined to act on their belief that we need to be environmentally protected and maybe spend a few more dollars on a more energy-saving appliance or car.
From the audience, on your website, you have a drop-down of 4 or 5 issues, and environment is not one of them. Where does the
We have to
environment,
fix that. Yeah.
and how would you respond to that?
No, I'm glad you can tell I did not spend time looking at our website because I am working among our people, but we'll fix that because I'm proud of my environmental record. You know, it's really, especially as someone who wants to have that sustainability, someone who's a member of the House majority who's taken votes repeatedly against the majority for environmental measures that we all cherish and to make sure the EPA has the power it needs to enforce the Clean Air, Clean Water Acts. I grew up in the Midwest. I worked in a steel mill to put myself through college. I know what life was like before the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. I never want to go back to that. So I will be more than happy to put my environmental record up on the website. And thank you for pointing it out. Paul.
New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli issued a report last month stating that we spend about $200 million a year in New York to upgrade our wastewater treatment capacity. Unfortunately, the need is 5 times as great.
Yeah.
Every year we fall $800 million further behind on investing in our water treatment infrastructure. Please speak generally about the importance of infrastructure investment and specifically about what you will do as a member of Congress to help close the gap.
Infrastructure investment is crucial, and I have said it repeatedly for a lot of reasons. One of them, of course, is environmental protection and improvements that we make with the knowledge that we acquire over the decades. Another is that this is a great source of jobs, and it's a wonderful way to keep people employed, keep them busy, keep them in the workforce. So there's another plus. What we have experienced in our country, however, is a massive misallocation of capital in so many ways. And again, I do not seek to be negative, but I have to put something out. When you said $200 million, what was it called? $200 million? Councilman Maloney has advocated for $200 million, interesting figure, to go toward the construction of a plant, an incinerator in Orange County. And one cannot claim to be for the environment and supportive of environmental concerns if you want to allocate $200 million to a plant that is not a gasification project that was rated CCC as a bad credit risk by Standard & Poor's, that New York Public Interest Research Group and the Partnership for Policy Integrity both failed. In fact, I have a letter here from NY-18 about how this plant would pollute with cadmium, lead, and benzene and dioxin in ways that we cannot tolerate. And yet the congressman, because this man, who unfortunately took great umbrage when I questioned the validity of his project, he did not support it, but he offered Congressman Maloney quite a bit of campaign help. And so the congressman is an advocate for this project. It's called Taylor Bilex. Please feel free to look it up. I had the integrity to say, no, I cannot support this, Mr. Taylor. But Congressman Maloney has felt very differently. That $200 million should go toward infrastructure, not toward a triple C, bad investment rated project that is simply a boondoggle. I hate to say it, but that's the truth. So that's how we get it. Well, we stop misallocating capital.
Joe?
Dan, do you support shutting down Indian Point, and if so, how quickly?
I don't. Now you know that. I've said it before. I think it is a very clean source of energy for the Hudson Valley. Would we site it there today? No. But even before I was ever in this life, I always supported Indian Point. It's an important source of power for us. It emits steam, as we all know. Should its environmental impact be mitigated? Yes, absolutely. And of course, there are questions about the fish population in the Hudson River. But no, I would not shut it down. It would be a very difficult and costly process. And if it is replaced by a natural gas burning plant, which, by the way, I support natural gas versus coal, it's a cleaner form of carbon energy, but to replace it with a natural gas burning plant would actually increase our carbon footprint here in the Hudson Valley. We'd be going backwards. So I do support the continued safe operation of Indian Point.
From the audience, rail car transporting of crude is a disaster waiting to happen. What will you do to enable the construction of the Keystone Pipeline and help open up the Canadian tar sands fields?
I have voted consistently to support, and I have talked about it before, to support the completion of the Keystone XL pipeline. I did take one vote, if I'm recalling correctly, because bills in the House are often imperfect. So I did take one vote, I think, not to support Keystone, because that particular bill had a provision that would have allowed drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so I rejected that bill because I could not support drilling in Anwar. But other than that, I have voted to support the construction of Keystone. I think it's an important, it's an important energy source that otherwise, as we know, will be shipped to other parts of the world in more dangerous ways. If processed in, say, China, where there is not nearly the concern about the environment that there is here. So I do support its completion.
Andy?
Regional trail networks are essential infrastructure that is important for tourism, regional economic development, public health, and recreation. What will you do to help facilitate their planning, design, and construction through legislation and also at the district level?
I think they're great to have. My family has taken advantage of the rail trails and the bike paths in Westchester County, of course, and it's a great way for everyone in the public to enjoy views of the Hudson Valley. So to the extent that I can be an advocate for easements or for provisions that allow land transfer, again, to the extent that there may be federal provisions that would make that more difficult, and I can facilitate transfer or ownership or easements, I'm happy to do that. But it would be great to be able to support with funding if possible. Sometimes that gets a little trickier when budgets are very tight, but certainly it's a great cause and one that I would be happy to support in any way I can. And I give personally to LCB and to many of our other local causes that support the environment and the community.
From the audience, what is your position on GMOs?
It's a great question. I'm a doctor. I know mention that. And I'm a mom. Of course, my kids eat pretty much whatever they want now for 2021. I don't inherently have as much concern about GMOs as many other people do. If you think about selective breeding in the creation of crops, including corn, which is, anybody remember Dr. Norman Borlaug? Marvelous man, one of the single human beings who created the most good for this planet of anyone. He died, Dr. Borlaug died a couple of years ago, age 99, but he helped to breed hardy corn that has fed the peoples of the world in more powerfully and more with greater sustainability than almost any other food source in history. And that's genetic modification in a sense. It's not literally taking a gene in the laboratory and inserting it into a seed genome, but it's the same thing. Selective breeding is genetic modification, just done at a slower scale or pace. So I think there should not be excessive fear about it. Should we always be vigilant? Of course. But I don't inherently object to GMOs. I do object to antibiotics in animal feed, by the way. I realize that's a slightly different topic, but I do have great concerns about our food supply and about its safety and about its soundness. And one of the biggest things we could do and the biggest benefits we could create as a public health issue is to stop feeding antibiotics in animal feed, in feedlots or beef, you name it. And I will work for that.
The United States scientists and engineers have invented or advanced the development of a whole host of clean energy technologies, solar, fuel cells, biomass technologies, and yet the profit from commercialization of those technologies often goes overseas. And a big reason is inconsistent tax policy in the United States at the federal level. What would you do to help fix the on-again, off-again tax support cycle that comes out of Washington to support these important new technologies so that we can see them successfully commercialized here at home?
Well, I think if it's number one, just fundamentally, as I think all of us have experienced in one way or another, the tax code in the United States is way too complicated. That actually does take resources away from the great initiatives that we want to pursue together as a nation, costing $4 trillion a year for people just to do their taxes, you know, people, individuals, companies, you name it. So we need a simple tax code. If a beneficial development has been funded through federal research, then I think it is reasonable to have stipulations regarding its deployment commercially. If federal taxpayer dollars are going toward its development. If it's strictly private, then so be it. But I can certainly rationally envision that there would be ways to try to provide protections for the taxpayer investment and the public good.
From the audience, your opponent said you have a 44% environmental record, and your flyer says you have the 5th highest score of House Republicans. Are both true, and is that a good environmental record?
Well, as you know, there are bills are scored, votes are scored in certain ways. An environmental record encompasses votes, yes, they are scored as they are scored, but it also encompasses positions of advocacy. It also encompasses work that we do in order to help with regulatory issues that involve environmental concerns, how we address the administration, how we address the interaction between local and state and federal government. And again, in terms of positions of advocacy, I'm very proud of what I have been an advocate for. I am proud of the votes I have taken in order to protect our environment, keep the EPA able to do the things that we needed to do to protect us. There are ways in which regulators can reach farther than they should, although I don't think having a public FERC is not necessarily a negative environmental vote. But again, one thing that isn't scored is the position on this global project that would put enormous amounts of pollution into the soil and air of the town of Montgomery, which is currently very clean and sweet. And $200 million taxpayer dollars should never go toward that kind of polluting initiative. And yet my opponent, the congressman, supports it. He has received considerable campaign funding from Mr. Taylor and his friends. The same was essentially implied to me, and I rejected it. Why? Because I had the integrity to say this makes no sense on any level. We have to keep those things in mind. I will be honest with you. When we agree, I hope we do, most of the time, or if we disagree, I will tell you and tell you why, because I want to represent you honestly and well, and make sure that we can do the things we need to do together.
So let me take another audience question as a follow-up. You say that you voted to enable the EPA to enforce regulations, yet you also voted to defund the EPA. How do you reconcile those positions?
There are certain aspects of programs that don't necessarily need as much funding as others. When we are in the kind of desperate times that we are in terms of the federal budget. In seeking to achieve that balance between fiscal sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability, there are times when we do have to pair budgets and do it in a way that will have the least detrimental impact. But it does mean that sometimes we do have to pair the budget with the EPA as well. But I have voted to uphold the power of the EPA to enforce the key provisions of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And I will continue to do so.
Was the budget that you voted for consistent in the degree of cuts to the EPA and other federal agencies, or would EPA have suffered deeper cuts than the average agency?
Paul's asking if the EPA would suffer relatively deeper cuts than other agencies. Paul, I would have to look back at the specifics because it's, there are numerous votes there. It's been a couple of years, so I'm not going to try to deceive on that. But whatever I have done, I've sought to do because I have felt it has been in the best net interest of our people, our country, and our environment.
Joe?
Man, I asked Congressman Maloney about the dysfunction in Congress and the gridlock, and he spoke about his ability to work in a bipartisan manner, and he said he wrote 13 bills that passed and pointed out you had written just one bill in 2 years. I just wondered if you think you can work in a bipartisan manner and what your thoughts are on that comment.
Yes, absolutely. And folks, I'm not going to go into specifics right now, but the Congressman's figures are selective. Let's put it that way. I was the primary sponsor for a crucial conference committee bill that allowed Medicare benefits and unemployment benefits and the payroll tax holiday to continue throughout 2012. And I was one of 8 House Republicans selected to make sure that that happened. That one achievement was worth probably at least 3 bills. When I was in the House of Representatives, the first day I was there, I got together with fellow freshman David Siciliani, Rhode Island, and we formed a Common Ground Caucus so that we could work together, just get to know each other socially. When Hurricane Irene struck, Peter Welch, my friend from Vermont, great congressman, a Democrat, and I worked together to make sure we were co-chairpeople of the Hurricane Irene Coalition. We brought back $11.5 billion. I should mention that. We'll talk about infrastructure after the storm. $11.5 billion was allocated because of our efforts. Democrats and Republicans working together. What that conference committee I just talked about, I had to work with the Democratic leadership of the Senate to get that done. We got it done. I respect my friends and colleagues who are Democrats. I have a lot in common with them. I have active Democrats supporting me in this campaign, and I'm very proud of that.
The U.S. EPA has proposed a new rule defining waters of the United States, and the purpose is to clarify their protection under the Clean Water Act. Do you support this measure?
Andy, I have to look at the current specifics, but I know that the navigable waters standard has caused, a certain amount of probably undue, if you will. In other words, it's going too far. There is some undue burden, if you will, on our local communities, on farms. I do think the EPA should be respected. I do think that there is a distinct federal role for protecting our air and our water. But certain of the rules governing ponds and seasonally wet marshlands probably are going a bit too far. Now, and I'm providing an honest answer because I don't know what the current standard is, but my goal is to have our communities be able to sustain themselves reasonably, rationally, appropriately, and well, be able to have local agriculture, be able to have open space preservation, be able to have maintenance of our communities without undue burdens that may be unrealistic and unreasonable. And unfortunately, you know, it can certainly err that way as well. Regulators tend to do that.
From our audience, you opposed Reggie when you ran for Congress 4 years ago. Are you still opposed to Reggie?
There's a particular reason for the objection, not so much to the existence of Reggie, but to the way they were using funds. Because they were not using, and this was the problem, they weren't using the funds actually for environmental benefits. They were using the funds, the state of New York was using the funds to pay to the general budget. And I didn't think that was right, I still don't think that's right. But you know, I'm all for initiatives, and you know, if the state wants to impose a certain standard for its air or water quality within its own borders, within its own waters, I don't have an objection to that. But my problem with Reggie was that the funds were going to the general budget and were not being dedicated as they should.
Nan, do you think that the long-term government response to hurricanes Sandy and Irene in terms of rebuilding and sustainability has been sufficient, or more proactive measures need to be taken?
Oh, definitely more proactive measures need to be taken, and it is terrible that it takes so long for funds that, you know, we fought in it, as I just mentioned, the bipartisan coalition, the Hurricane Relief Coalition. We got $11.5 billion worth of funds allocated for the state of New York, and well, and for the devastated regions, including, of course, the state of New York. Millions and billions of dollars for that now. And yet, it took months or years for those funds. Some of them are only now being allocated. The Congressman takes credit for them. They actually were, I just want you to know, they were allocated when I was at the House, that $11.5 billion. That was when we were there. So please let's correct that record. But they take all too many years to go into the hands of the local folks who need to have that help. And that has to do with bloated bureaucracies. It has to do with processes that don't make sense. For example, let's have concurrent reviews instead of consecutive reviews. Let's try not to change the goalposts so frequently that it becomes almost impossible for people to sustain a project. There are other ways in which we can try to approach this